So just in case you thought that from now on you had to be effective all the time, this put some of the pressure of you. We were partly ineffective in our communication with the moderator who didn't show up. So we'll do some improvising. You've been a great audience and you've been listening very well, and I'm sure that, like all of us had when we entered this movement, you have a lot of questions, so I want to honor that and then leave enough time for your questions. There are some questions that I'm going to tackle that we prepared in the beginning, and then it's up to you, and we see what kind of doubts and hesitations and whatever you have.
Can I just ask the audience, does anyone feel like they've changed their mind on some things since the beginning of the day? A few hands, yeah, okay. Everyone's very shy, but like, you know, yeah, it's good. Yeah, someone's got 2 hands up. Changed a lot of minds. Great, cool. That's really, yeah, I'm very happy to hear that. You know, I think, we've got 4 people up here, and we've all got different perspectives, and we'll all say different things. But I think what's really important is that idea of being open to changing your mind. And it's not, you know, necessarily that you'll end up believing the same things, and you'll all come to it with your own perspectives. But that's really, you know, sort of heartening to hear that already people have started to think about things differently. And I hope that, like, at the end of the question session, you know, you can give us like really, you know, good questions, and then we will, you know, hopefully answer them. But like, that's not necessarily the right answer. And if you can go away and come up with some criticisms that really challenge the way we think, that's great too, because that means that we get better at and get more effective. So yeah, I think it's great that we have the opportunity to kind of, yeah, back and forth. So anyway, sorry.
All right.
Yeah.
I think the open-mindedness is one of the most attractive parts of the community. The ability of everybody to be able to think whatever they want without being accused of wrong think, of thought crime, and all that. Okay. So first question is that maybe you feel also some pressure in the sense that you feel that you have a lot of personal responsibility right now, and you have to like start giving money away, or like staying and like wait next to a drowning pond till the child is drowning there or something. Of course, and I can imagine there's a lot of you who are thinking like, what about our governments? And we are already giving money. We're paying a lot of taxes to our government to do good. What should they do, and what is like the balance, or what is the focus between, or how do you distribute the focus between our own responsibility and our government? I'll ask this question to Sam, because he has experience with governments.
Yeah, it's a tricky question, because of course you can think, well, yeah, I pay my taxes, haven't I done enough? So I think instead of thinking about how much tax you necessarily pay, I think it's interesting to look at just how much money you need to live on and how much money you take home. And it was because I knew that this question might be coming up, I may have been given a hint. I just checked and to see whether there was a big difference between the amount of income that you need to live a good life in the United Kingdom versus the amount that you need to live in the United States versus the amount that you need to live in Belgium. And it's really not that different between those countries. They're all, you know, rich, developed countries, but the amount of take-home income that the average person has is pretty much the same, and that's after taxes. So that means that the amount of, you know, income that you have discretion over is not that different. And yet the United States donates a lot more money than the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom donates about 50% more money than Belgium. So I think on one level it's just, you know, not necessarily true that, you know, there might be, you know, this might be that status quo bias that, you know, if you don't already have that culture of giving, then it might not actually be the case that you're necessarily losing more or less relative to the amount of tax income. The other thing you have to think about is, can you like outbid your government? That's basically a nice way of thinking about it. So depending on where you're from in the world, I think most places, if you donate money, you get a tax deduction. So depending on your top tax rate, you're basically hedging money against the next thing that your government would do against the most effective thing that you could do. So do you think, so we know that the government, I know the UK numbers better, but in the United Kingdom, the government will spend about £30,000 to save 1 year of healthy life. So remember Tara was talking about Kaposi sarcoma, that's about that level. So it's a good intervention, but that's 1 year of healthy life for about £30,000. Whereas you can save a whole life, as some mentioned, by donating £3,000, so 1/10 of that money, to the Against Malaria Foundation. So you've gone from your government, which can save, you know, in its very efficient healthcare system, the NHS is one of the most efficient and most effective healthcare systems in the world, and you've gone from saving a year to a whole life at 1/10 the price. So I think that's another thing to consider is the government necessarily going to do as much with that money as you can? Now, in many cases they will, because they will be able to conquer economies of scale. But I don't think it necessarily means that we can just say, like, well, we don't have any more responsibilities because we've paid our taxes. I think we need to look at what we can actually contribute, and I think many of us can continue to contribute even if we have paid a lot in taxes.
So, if I understand you correctly, it would be an ethical thing to like work in black under the counter and not pay taxes and use the taxes to like spend them on a more effective purpose.
I don't think so, because I think that you're always making these hard trade-offs between the social cohesion in your community, and of course, you know, part of the reason that, you know, the quality of life here is on average so high is because you pay taxes, right? You get, in return for those taxes, you do get a lot of social services, and if you look at Belgium in the OECD, you know, of course, sometimes you look at the government and you think, oh, what's the government doing now? But on average, the quality of life in Belgium, measured on a range of different indices, is among the highest in the world. And so it's like, you know, you do get some payoffs for that, and of course, people deserve to live happy, healthy lives. So it's not that Belgium should, you know, just suddenly stop paying taxes and the society here crumble in order to, you know, buy a bed net somewhere else. They're all part of building a better world, and so part of that is functioning social and democratic institutions. Part of that is a functioning economy that, you know, allows people to move around. Part of it is an international migration system. Part of that, you know, all of those things come together to build a good world. So it's not one or the other, and I think that's an important point. We shouldn't focus just on the extreme cases or take any of these things to their absolute logical extreme without considering other effects.
Can I offer a slightly different perspective? Yeah. So another thing to think about, as well as what you do with your donations, is when you pay taxes, you could consider that it's your moral responsibility to make sure that the government uses that tax money effectively. So we see the same problems with the way that governments allocate money as we do in charity, and because often political parties, their incentive is to do what will get them re-elected next year. So they're thinking on often, you know, 2, 3, or 4 year time horizons, whereas a lot of what we've talked about today is the impact on the long run future and things that we care about our lives, the rest of our lives, and our children's and grandchildren's, many other people's lives, and governments aren't necessarily focusing on that. So there's a lot of work we can do in advocating for governments to use the same kinds of research that we're doing to evaluate charities, to evaluate their programs, and make sure that they're investing in interventions which are really effective and doing things that align with our values. So interacting with government is another way that you can perhaps make a really big difference, aside from just donating.
So we talked about potential efficiency or inefficiency of governments. Let's look at NGOs in so organizations, non-profit organizations in Belgium. Is Sigrid here?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you say some? You're from donorinfo.be, right? Can you say something about what you do and what services you provide to people who want the mic?
We're an independent information center on the financial means and activities of philanthropic organizations in Belgium, and which means that we publish their finances in a very transparent way. They have to work with us on that because they have to allow us to have a look into their finances, into very detailed finances. In a sense, we're a quality label for them. At the moment, there are 250 organizations on our website. It can all be consulted for free. You can look at their finances on a daily basis if you like. But as we were talking about the government and donations, I was looking at our survey. We did a survey on that, and actually Belgium is not doing so bad because for the government, in terms of subsidies, the government allocates 36% of subsidies, and the Belgians donate more than 50%. So actually, there are more donations going to the philanthropic organizations that they are being subsidized, which is good news, I would say. If that's very effective in terms of what you've just been discussing, I can't say because we haven't surveyed it in that way. But so.
So hearing this, what do you think might be missing? What could we use in Belgium in terms of like meta charities, or how could your services be expanded to everything we need, like a GiveWell? Or
yeah, I think transparency is really, really important because, and that's transparency across the whole chain. So it's the financial transparency, but it's also the organisational accountability. It's also making sure that what happens on the ground is validated. So this is when we think about an organisation like GiveWell, who they're doing transparency not just for the organisation, they're also looking at what's actually happening on the ground, and does it make sense for you to invest money in distributing school uniforms when instead you could be distributing bed nets or something like that. So they're looking for independent scientific verification. So I think to the extent that you're looking at these causes, it's important to consider the whole chain. I think one thing too with finances, I think people have this natural instinct that, if people in charity are paid well, that's a bad thing because it means that the money that we're donating, I want my dollar to be the dollar that saves the person's life. I don't want it to be the dollar that pays for some charity executive's holiday. So, but I think we need to get around that mindset and remember that the money that's spent across the charity or across the organisation, this doesn't just hold for charities, but we need to get out of the mindset that just because charities, for example, pay high salaries to executives, maybe that means that they can attract an executive who makes a charity 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 times better and or more effective. And if that's the case, then that's money well spent. And it's also the case that if you and you sometimes get this with austerity as well. So this transcends charity. This is also in government, where you have, for example, you have people saying, well, okay, we need to make cutbacks, but we won't cut frontline services. We'll just cut the fat at the back end. The administrators, the people who just, they push paper around. We won't cut any doctors and nurses. But the people who push paper around are important because they make the doctors and nurses more effective. And so if you cut their jobs, then the doctors and the nurses have to do the paperwork instead of saving lives. So I think the analogy holds for charity as well. We need to make sure that we're not just focusing on the split between, what's being spent on programs and what's being spent on administration. We need to take a holistic view and say, what's the organisation actually doing in the real world, and what does it cost to get that? And if the cost of getting that is paying for a lot of advertising to make your cause, noticed, paying for a lot of great people who can run your organisation really, really well, and paying for those kinds of things, and then that means you can do more good in the real world, then I think that's fantastic. But I think it sounds like your organisation is doing great work.
Yes, well, the thing we really want to do is provide donators and people who want to give time or money to organisations, is to provide them with the correct tools so they can have the correct information and make a good decision on the basis of the tools that we offer to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll finish up on this in just a sec, but I think the one thing we have to be careful of is when there's this problem, and there might be a name for it as a cognitive bias, but this idea where you get the one true metric, and you use a metric like how much money does the charity spend on program?
Good Arts Law. That's right.
That's right.
Website.
Yeah,
it's
for sure. No, that's right.
The naked numbers are there.
No, for sure.
There's no metric, no ratio. It's up to you to decide
and that's really cool.
Look into it.
But yeah, as Sarah said, it's called Good Arts Law, and it's basically where you have this number which is like a ratio or it's a metric or something like that, and you forget that that's supposed to be a proxy for something in the real world. And instead of keeping track of what's happening in the real world and being like, okay, this thing that we want to happen is happening, you just look at the metric and see that the metric's going up. But there might be lots of different ways to make the metric go up. And so if you're not continually tracking what's happening in the real world and you just make the number go up, well, if you're making the number go up by like, oh, our charity's really efficient, we fired all our staff. So, then you can have these perverse outcomes. So it's something to be aware of in this context. But it sounds like, that sounds like a great organisation. So, yeah, sure.
Yeah, something to add. For me, I realized that as an effective altruist, I should become more like simply like a consumer. In a supermarket, or I want to buy a computer, I'm mostly interested in price and quality. How much memory does a computer have for the price? I'm not interested in the marketing budget of Apple, what the COO earns. I'm not interested, as most consumers, we are not interested in those things. We never ask those questions. How tasty is the biscuit and how much does it cost? That's what's important. Yeah? And so we should look this way at charities as well. And then we have to realize that what we know for sure is that some charities might be 1,000 times or 100 times more effective than others. And so a lot of people say, like, we look at overhead and how much the CEO earns. But now it's possible that there is a charity with 50% overhead costs that is 100 times more effective than a charity with 10% overhead costs. Yeah? Still, I would support this charity with 50% overhead costs because it's 100 times more effective. So $1, you can calculate how much that's good. And so this kind of information, it was not always a lot of charity evaluators in the past. They simply calculated percentage overhead cost and things like that, and that was kind of misleading for a lot of donors. So, and then there was this GiveWell organization, and they figured out, like, we don't care about overhead costs, and we simply call them, and how much healthy life years do I save if I donate you how much dollars, how much healthy life years? And then they saw, wow, there's an order of magnitude difference. And that was actually one of the most important triggers of this effective altruism movement. What we thought about charities was wrong, and then we have now more information. So that's.
So I'd like to turn to the room and see if you have any questions at this point, and if you don't have any, you haven't thought deeply enough. Yeah, you're in the front. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would like.
Speak up as loud as possible.
Sorry, I
If you can.
don't have a large voice. But
Yeah.
We can repeat it.
I'd like to make a point about quality of experience next to quantity. I feel today that there's been a lot of emphasis on quantity and the number of lives saved, number of healthy years lived, and it feels a bit like the different kinds of suffering are a bit neglected, because if you say, for example, that it was 10 times world peace is the same as eradicating smallpox. Well, someone who is murdered in a war, I think for the people around them, the suffering might be different than for someone who dies from the disease. And I'm not sure, I hope there is a lot of research also going into that. It wasn't clear today, but
Okay,
it
so
seems like an important point.
the question was like, you have the impression that there's a lot of focus on quantity, so how many lives are being helped, or but the question is like, to what extent do we also focus on the quality of life and on degrees in differences in suffering, like you asked, I think, a bit regarding animals.
Similar point.
Anybody wants to react to that?
So, measuring these kinds of things can be really hard, but we take the approach that we have to start somewhere, and we do try to incorporate these types of things that we normally call them flow-through effects into account. So when we look at how much harm is caused by malaria, we should take into account not just the effect of a child dying, but also the loss and grief that their mother might feel at losing a child, and the loss of income to the family, or loss of help later on. And then we try to add all of those different impacts in when we think about the value of that intervention. The same kind of thing when we look at other cause areas as well. And so while we often start with a very rough, very simple measure, such as the number of lives saved per dollar, then we normally use that to narrow down to the right order of magnitude, because we're looking at causes where there can be thousands of times difference between them. We can use this rough and ready calculation to find maybe the top handful that we think are among the most effective ones, and then we can try to add in the more qualitative things to try and narrow down our choice between those top few interventions and add in more terms to the equation, basically. So we take the approach that while it can be very difficult to measure some things, we can actually, in fact, make some attempt to measure anything and just wrap that in.
Yeah, so I can add, first of all, we see a huge, first of all, there's a metric, quality adjusted life years. So what people do is basically take the quality into account as far as possible with a group of people trying to think about how would it feel like being blind, how would it feel like, so we have this metric. Now we see that some interventions are 10 times, do for the same dollar invested, save 10 times more healthy life years. Even that means your error in estimating the quality, you're allowed to have a very big error margin. If one intervention is 10 times more effective, according to how you calculate quality adjusted life years, perhaps you calculate it wrong. You're you have the wrong metric. It's unlikely that you're a factor of 1000% wrong. That's one thing. But there is a very important thing that I do have to mention with this irrational fear thing. So we have the fear of war and terrorism and the fear of diseases. And it is true that, so in both cases, we see 10 times more children dying with smallpox than with terrorism. Okay, but still, the parents and then the community are more afraid of terrorism than of the flu and viruses. And so this fear can be irrational, because why are you more afraid of something that is 10 times less lethal? Still, I think it's important to take this, even if it's an irrational fear, we have to take it into account, and we can do different things. Either we simply take into account the suffering, or we do something to de-bias ourselves, to make our fears more rational, to cope with that our fears are more in line with the statistics. On this second strategy, how to make our fear more rational, that's very difficult. We don't know how to do it. As long as we can't clearly do that in a safe way that respects everyone's autonomy, especially, I would say we have to take irrational fears into account.
Yeah, that was
And-
kind of my point.
And those parents, but still then it's unlikely that the suffering of the parents is, so here 10 children die, 10 parents suffer, here 1 child die, 1 couple of parents suffer. It's, for me it's unlikely to believe that the suffering of this these parents trumps the suffering of the 10
Yeah,
parents.
that one example, but it's more, to kind of point to the fact that it's difficult and it's not easy to make those kind of comparisons without really based on numbers.
But the conclusion is some interventions are 10 orders of magnitude more efficient. So I'm pretty safe that it's very unlikely that our estimates of qualities and so on are so bad. So we know it now that some interventions save 10 times more children. So it's a fair bet to focus on those many children.
Thank you. Other questions from the room? Yes?
I think that there is a science about health economics, and science that is well developed because the pricing and the reimbursement of medical products is depending on it, and that for us to decide about effective altruism, I would give the advice to piggyback on that science.
I'm
think
a
that's
health
what
economist. Yeah, so before I got involved in effective altruism, I guess that was the path that I took. So I studied pharmacy and then health economics, and then that's where I started to find out more and more about this. And there are a lot of lessons, and some of these ideas like quality adjusted life years and other metrics, disability adjusted life years, a lot of these studies are coming out of that community. But I think the thing that's been really exciting to me about effective altruism is coming from that small niche and then finding out that there are also ethicists and philosophers who are thinking about some of these questions and adding novel ideas to my understanding of how to think about health and well-being going forward. And then also sort of more like social economists who are thinking about pricing and markets and how we can use sort of more other like the sort of entrepreneurial system and development of new sort of technological advances like better internet and mobile phones to do good as well. So I think that's why the EA is really exciting, because we can combine the different skills and different approaches from all different kinds of sciences just to answer this question about how can we do the most good. So yeah, more economists I think we need.
Just very quickly too, and this sort of wraps up both questions. I think there is this sense that like when you put a number on something that it becomes, somehow colder or more calculating or more dehumanized. But it's the sort of thing I think where, sometimes when you reduce everything down to one number, you're going to miss a lot. But it doesn't mean that we can't measure a lot of things. And I think the way to get around this is not to say, okay, the metric doesn't capture everything, so we should get rid of that. It's to say, let's expand our definition. Let's build in more, and this kind of goes to your point as well. So, and I think just echoing Tara's excitement about effective altruism being this very interdisciplinary community. So there's people from health economics who can help us figure out what numbers to put on the suffering caused by various diseases. But then there's people from all kinds. And I would urge anyone who is in a particularly social science, but any science or any field whatsoever really, to try and engage with these things and think out how your discipline could benefit from the ideas, but also what ideas your discipline could contribute. Because there are obviously going to be blind spots, and so it's I think it's not just health economists, but it might be anthropologists who can tell us more about how different communities behave under certain conditions, and what can we learn from that, and how does that affect how I think about things. So I think it's definitely we need people from different communities in order to help us think about these things systematically from lots of different perspectives.
Just one brief comment. I think that's another example of a moral illusion, that idea that a lot of people have, like within the effective altruism community, we are focused on numbers, analytics, and this kind of analytic thinking. It's kind of cold-hearted, as people say. But if I didn't mention it in my presentation, but if you think about it, that might be kind of a moral illusion as well. It doesn't mean that you're cold-hearted when you're more analytic, when looking at statistics and so on. But you can think about it, what this means, this idea of cold-heartedness, what this really means.
More questions from the room?
Yes, I hope you do not suggest when I'm driving down the road I have to avoid a chicken to kill a kid on the sidewalk.
Why would anybody be suggesting that?
Because he equalized an individual human being with these moral illusions with an individual animal.
Well, on that shows, these are famous burning house dilemmas. We're going to save your child or the dog, things like that. In my PhD research, I studied this kind of question: are you a speciesist if you would save a child instead of the chicken, or with the car? It's the same situation. Now, it's not necessarily speciesist. For example, you would probably save your child, or instead of a child from Africa. That doesn't mean that you're a racist. You probably save your child instead of 10 children in Africa. That doesn't mean that you're racist. You might be racist when you kill a child in Africa and eat it. Then that's something else. So with the car example, I guess I know one animal rights activist who really claims it's not like flipping a coin in that situation. Chicken or kid, it's the same choice, flipping a coin. I know one animal rights activist, but it's one of the many. Most of them are tolerant towards this kind of partiality. I'm tolerant towards your kind of partiality. If you save the child, I would save the child probably.
Sounds a little bit paternalistic. You are tolerant.
Yeah, I cannot judge. If you kill the chicken instead of the child with your car, it's difficult to judge you, because you might play this game. How tolerant should we be towards our own choices, and how partial we should be? But we agree that simply killing someone on purpose and then eating that person, that's something else.
So, I guess like how I think about it is often we're not here to try and tell you what you should value. We're just here to provide a lot of information to help you decide, given what you value, what's the most ethical action that you can take. So if you go to effectivealtruism.org, we actually have a couple of calculators online where you can put in things like, well, how many chicken lives do you think are equivalent to 1 year of human life, and put in the value, the numbers that you think are appropriate, and sort of step through some of these questions, and then we can help try and answer questions about, well, you know, given your values, does it make sense for you to donate to charities working in global poverty or those working in prevention of animal suffering? And so we build lots of calculators like this all the time to help people decide where to donate, what to do with their time. So check it out online and try and step through and see where you end up.
Maybe just adding that like this is not like taking the complete package or nothing. You know, it's not an all or nothing thing. It's like I have personally, there's things that I find very valuable in the effective altruist philosophy, and other things that I'm not quite ready for. And Chris said that with Stan there's like hardly any difference between his cognition and his behavior. In my case, there's more. Like just to give an example, I was at the sanctuary in the US where there were wolves, and there were just 20 wolves there, and I thought, like, from an effective altruist viewpoint, I wouldn't donate anything to this because this is not the most efficient thing in the world. And at the same time, I knew I would feel really bad if I left there without making any donations, so I gave something. So that contradicts maybe my rationality about effective altruism. And for me, that's right now, that's the way it is. And so that's what I want to say. Like, you can take some ideas here and there, try to apply them. Some of them will be really counterintuitive. Maybe they fit later, maybe they fit never. But the thing that is important, I think, is to keep an open mind and to get more and more. I'm trying to get the question here, but they're also like difficult to read.
Yeah, and I've been gone, so I don't know what's been discussed yet. There are some about implementing as well, like what are
right.
ways of.
I'll take this one I can read. What is the most efficient way to counter climate change? Does effective altruism have any opinions or strategies, interventions that you recommend?
So it's a really, really hard question because you remember that framework we had where importance, tractability, and neglectedness. So how hard is the problem to solve? How big is it? And how many people are already working on it? So in a couple of these things, we might say maybe climate change isn't the first thing we should be working on. Partly on neglectedness, because climate change, relative to many other causes, actually has a lot of people, you know, the whole renewable energy industry, it has, you know, you think of the Paris Climate Conference and things like that. There's already a lot of people working on this problem. But I mentioned the Paris Climate Conference. That shows that tractability is really low, because part of the reason that climate change is such a big issue is even though basically everyone agrees that it's bad, being the first person to move on it is always, like, it's slightly worse, because you're not making that big a difference as one actor, but everyone else gets the benefits of continuing to pollute. So there's what's called a coordination problem. And coordination problems are notoriously hard to solve. So this presents a problem because, you know, can we make a big headway on the important stakes? Obviously it's huge, right? It's global warming, right? It's, you know, everyone is going to be affected by it. But it does make it very difficult. I think, so Citizens Climate Lobby, you can check them out. I think on the Giving What We Can website, we actually have a write-up about climate change charities. So if you are just looking for the most effective way to offset carbon, then there are a couple of charities, one called Cool Earth, and basically what they do is they avert rainforests, so deforestation, and that we think, like in terms of how much CO2 that you can possibly hope to avert, that's probably one of the biggest things you can do. Now that of course doesn't address the bigger problem of the fact that we're still extracting a lot of fossil fuels and we're still burning a lot of them and putting a lot of CO2 equivalent into the future, into the atmosphere. So there are lots of different things you could think of there. The Citizens Climate Lobby is one organisation that does advocacy, and they seem to be getting good results because they're doing a lot of testing of their messaging and learning. but it's a particularly hard problem. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be focusing on it, and we have looked into that, but it's, I think, relative to the number of people who are already working on it, you have to always think about, like, is my extra contribution going to move the needle? So it's not that these people shouldn't be working on it. I'm very glad that we have huge numbers of people working on this problem. The question is, if you're going into that field versus another field, because, you know, particularly if you're still at the early stages of your career and you're still making those decisions, are you going to be able to you know, when I say move the needle, does that sort of make sense? You're like, how much extra benefit you're going to get there. Now, if you're a particularly skilled political lobbyist, if you're a great communicator, if you're someone who has an idea for renewable technology that's going to make, you know, solar photovoltaic cells, you know, 10% more effective and 50%, you know, as much, you know, cost 50% as much, then, you know, like, that seems like a really, really important thing to do. I think one thing we have to be aware of is that a lot of the causes that we put up are ones that we think that basically everyone is able to contribute to in a meaningful way. You know, if you donate to Against Malaria, that's something that basically everyone can do. And so it's a good kind of recommendation for everyone. But it is good to hold in your head this idea that, well, actually my comparative advantage is working on climate change. So even if it's not one of the causes that you know, people put up on the screen, because there are lots and lots of different causes, it might still be a cause that I personally can, you know, make a big difference in. So always be aware of that context.
Just briefly add, on the Giving What We Can website, I've read a very interesting analysis. If you care about human health, healthy life years, if that is your metric, the thing that you want to maximize, there's a very interesting, very long calculation how cost effective it would be as you, as an individual, to donate money to climate or other, Against Malaria Foundation and so on. So it's a very interesting read, check it out.
I'll take a question that's about something completely different, but it is a topic within effective altruism. The question is, do you believe that artificial intelligence is a potential good thing, solving our problems and the suffering in the world? AI, artificial intelligence, might be smarter than Homo sapiens. What about development of artificial intelligence and the potential dangers of it?
Yeah, so this is a question that many EAs think about quite a lot. So it seems plausible that just like with the development of nuclear weapons, there are many new technologies that humanity could develop in the future which have the potential to cause a large amount of harm. And with artificial intelligence in particular, we see some really interesting things happening. So we're both developing amazing translation technology, which helps us, you know, the world become more connected and makes coordination easier. We're developing better predictive algorithms, which help us treat lots of different diseases much more effectively and much more cheaply. And it seems like every day there's a new AI company which is making the world a better place. But on the other hand, sometimes some of these programs behave in sort of unpredictable ways and give us some results that are not exactly what we might expect. And that's partially just because it's quite difficult to write a computer program that performs in exactly the way that you predict it will. And so the other thing, though, is that some of these, with the advance of technology, we need to think about how that might affect our labour market, because many jobs are becoming automated, especially a lot of data processing jobs. You know, now you see these automatic cashiers in supermarkets and banks, when previously people were doing those jobs. So what we want to think about is for any sort of new development that has the potential to dramatically change our lives and those lives into the future, we want to research that quite a lot and look into in what worlds will this be positive and improve lives a lot, and in what worlds might this be really negative. And if there are some worlds where this might be really negative, what can we do to make sure that as this technology develops, we do so safely and prevent those bad outcomes?
So I think one thing with this where it kind of gets a bit counterintuitive is that, so particularly on the issue of artificial intelligence, is computer programs, as Tara said, sometimes behave unpredictably. And they often, you know, you're asking a computer program to do something, and it will just, because computers are computers, they can just keep doing it. So let's say that you built something that was trying to, you know, like make a product. It might be the case that you just say, make more of this product. Now let's say that computer system is very, very complex. You can't see all the ways that it's going to behave. Maybe it ends up being that these computer programs that we're making get better and they get improved to the point where actually they can outthink humans. So computers can already outthink humans on lots of dimensions. So for example, they can calculate much faster than us. But what if they can predict human behaviour? I mean, at the moment we're getting algorithms where people, computers are starting to be able to predict, lots and lots of different things. And so let's say they can predict human behaviour. What happens if turning off the computer stops it from making the product? What would the computer do? And it doesn't actually have to do this, having any values. The computer doesn't have to like or dislike humans. It can just be indifferent. Maybe the thing that the computer wants to do is make lots and lots of copies of, this tablet. So we've made a computer and it makes lots of copies of this particular, this tablet here. And as it keeps going, it's like, oh, okay, we just need to make more of them as cheaply as possible. Well, it turns out that it's cheaper, instead of using all of these machines, maybe it's cheaper to just enslave all humans. Now, it's not because it wants to do that, or because it's thinks that it's a bad thing a good thing or a bad thing. It's because it's indifferent. It's just been told to do something, and then we haven't kind of thought about all of the consequences of that. I think if you think about a children's story, when you get the genie and you rub the genie and you get 3 wishes, and you ask it to do, I want to have, all the money in the world, I want to have it. And then it turns out, well, okay, you've taken all the money in the world and everyone else dies because they don't have any money. And then you're like, oh, well, wish I'd thought of that. And then, all the story of King Midas, where he's like, I wish that everything I touched turned to gold. And then his daughter, he touches his daughter, comes in for a hug, and then now his daughter is a gold statue instead of the person that he loved. So it's about thinking of those unintended consequences. We often neglect these other ways that they could go wrong, even if the process that's making it go wrong isn't inherently bad. So that's the kind of the argument, I think, for when we start building machines that start to match us in our capabilities. How can we be sure that we're not inadvertently going to make some problems for ourselves? Because we've killed a lot of species, not because we wanted to send them extinct, but because we just kind of didn't care about their habitat destruction or something like that. And maybe a computer system that became smarter than us could have the same effect. So I think it's, as Tara said, there's huge potential for upside, but those risks, even if they're very small risks, are ones that we really want to make sure that we're on top of.
And I guess if you're interested in these sort of questions, there are a lot of organisations researching both artificial intelligence but also other novel technologies that might just really disrupt how we live our lives. Things like blockchain technology or virtual reality or sort of space travel and other things. So you might want to check out the Future of Humanity Institute, which looks at the sort of higher level questions. The Machine Intelligence Research Institute specifically does research into how to ensure that artificial intelligence is created in a safe manner. The Future of Life Institute, which at the moment talks a lot about autonomous weapons and tries to work with the global community to help governments coordinate to sort of prospect and figure out what threats might be looming in the future that we can prevent.
Last question is, do you think the EA movement should focus on individual behavior change? And one of the examples is buying clothes, for instance. And well, in the book by William McCaskill, the book that you can win when you enter the survey, he talks about that well, on the one hand, sweatshops may not be that problematic, and about fair trade maybe not being that good. So these are some very controversial things, especially for people who are part of like the green environmental movement. So do you have any opinion? If you want to read the whole thing, you can find it in the book. It's really interesting. It's really challenging. You guys have any opinions about the value of behavior change? William McCaskill is kind of critical about it. What do you think about it?
So,
I'm really sorry, but it's my question. I feel it's a little bit misinterpreted.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't necessarily mean buying clothes that are fair trade. I just mean not buying clothes, full stop, that are being produced. So there are enough, like if you think in terms of 7 billion people, there are enough clothes.
Okay.
There are probably enough clothes for the next 100 years.
Yeah.
So buying clothes new would stimulate production, and we should be stupid altogether whether it is fair trade or from
Yeah.
scratch.
Okay. Right. So this is more of a question of about the kind of the economic system we live in. Right. So yeah, so this is a really hard question. I think a lot of people, especially if you've been thinking about different ways of helping, you might look at the way that capitalism distributes resources and conclude that that's pretty unjust. Why is it the case that we can buy labour so much more cheaply overseas than we can here? Why is it that we put people into jobs which are dehumanising or make them miserable? And that goes for whether that's people working in sweatshop conditions or people working in office jobs where they're just doing data processing and they not really engaging with their work. So just for full disclosure, I come from my background is in politics, and I used to be part of the Labor Party in Australia. So it's a workers' party, and it definitely has a lot of this kind of analysis saying there is something fundamentally unjust about the way that capitalism distributes resources, and we should change that. So whenever I get asked this question, I just always ask people about what is it that we should be doing differently, and then think through, okay, well, what's the next step that will... Because if you're talking about, well, we should have better labour market regulation, that we should make sure that people get paid a living wage, all of these kinds of things, then they tend to be things that crop up in sort of either social democracies or democratic socialism. This is what's sometimes called a Fabian socialism. That is basically saying, okay, well, we recognise that the global economic market exists, but we want to mitigate its worst excesses. And you can go all the way down the chain to saying, well, I think we should have a socialist economy where the government distributes all the resources, all the way up to anarcho-syndicalism, where you would say, well, let's just not have this kind of global economy. Let's live in communes where people take it upon themselves to provide for each other. I think at any step of this chain, the further you go down there, the more problematic it gets. Not because the idea isn't cool, but because first of all, we've seen implementation problems. So I think anyone who's interested in this stuff and making really big shifts to the economic order needs to look at the example of the Soviet Union, because we saw, there were millions upon millions of people died as a result of the economic changes there. So maybe we need to have a certain conservatism in how radically we reshape our economic order, because I don't think that we can, you need to be very careful about the sort of means justifies the ends kind of philosophy that would say, well, yes, it was worth us, having 30 million deaths, and then Russia is now sort of still not recovered economically from that as a result of those years. So I think it's an important question, and I don't have a concrete answer of should we have a different economic system. It's simply that while we can acknowledge that capitalism is fundamentally unjust and relies on inequality in order to stimulate production, maybe it results in useless production, as you mentioned with clothes, or where we're over-consuming, and that has all these knock-on effects, like we're over-extraction of fossil fuels. There is, I think, and I've thought very long and hard about these kind of alternatives. I'm not sure that there's a convincing case that the kind of the progressive incremental change way of doing things is not inherently sort of superior to the let's burn everything to the ground and then try and build something from the ashes. I think there's a lot of disagreement on that question, and lots of people think we should burn everything down and then start again. But I don't think that that's necessarily the way that I would like to do it. So I think we need to work within government for social change, and we need to reform unjust economic systems. But let's do it in a way that is sort of working towards that, because if we have unintended consequences, they could be huge.
Yeah, that's why I say do it from an individual standpoint. Obviously, debating whether capitalism is good or bad isn't really a productive debate, because it's not up for debate. I mean, the people on top of the chain in capitalism have way too much power for it to ever change in the next God knows how many years. So we should individually support, not support, or support the industries that we think make sense, and then this system will reform itself.
So I think there's a big value judgment going there. I'll pass over to someone else in a sec, but there's a big value judgment there about whether that inequality creates so much unhappiness So yeah, okay, obviously, yeah, we have some people, I mean, as Tara said, showed that graph, you know, goes 40 stories in the air. No one deserves that amount of money. Like, no one has any right to have that amount of money, and yet they do. And so the question is, if we take that money away and we, you know, we start to equalise things, or if we as individuals start, you know, just opting out of this system, does that lead to better quality of life for everyone? And I would say, you know, something like the Industrial Revolution, for example. So we look over the last 200 years of human history. Now that's, you know, the Industrial Revolution is what Marx was writing about and saying, you know, well, should we, yeah, like, aren't these new means of production fundamentally unjust? But you look at the proportion of the world's population that now lives in absolute poverty. Now, at the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, only about 5% of people would have cleared that, you know, $1.90 a day kind of poverty line. So 95% of the world's population is in extreme poverty. Now, today, we've inverted that, mostly through economic growth, and now it's about 15% goes under the line. So you can argue that there are a bunch of negative externalities here, but I think that's, you know, there have also been incredible improvements to people's quality of life. And the fact that we have a world of 7 billion people, 7 billion beings who are, you know, alive and in general have reasonably good lives, I think suggests that there is something important there. And whether that injustice is enough to justify kind of maybe losing some of those gains, I think is a very big and difficult question. I don't have an answer, but I don't think it's as obvious as we should opt out of that system altogether. So,
yeah,
I guess I'll just speak to the whether personal actions, say opting out of particular things, is effective. So I think for any sort of thing, whether we're talking about buying clothes or becoming vegetarian or doing anything else, the effective altruism approach would be to say, okay, well, like, what outcome do you want to see in the world? And is this particular action the best thing that you can do with your time, money, energy, and attention in order to get to that better world? So I think, like, I've been really impressed recently in the US with a lot of work that's been done by a small number of people who are lobbying large corporations to switch from using battery cages to produce the majority of their eggs, which causes immense amounts of suffering, to cage-free eggs. And, you know, that's still a terrible life for all of those chickens, but it's a dramatic improvement. And that was a massive effect, massive reduction in suffering from a small number of people lobbying these corporations. And I'm like really, really surprised and like, glad to see that we can have such an effect from that kind of action. Whereas it would have taken many sort of millions and millions and millions of customers in the US swapping from buying you know, caged eggs to cage-free eggs to cause the same dramatic reduction in chicken suffering. So with anything, we should think, okay, so like, is the best choice for me to make to sort of spend more money or less money on this particular product, or is it to do something else entirely, to advocate for something, to write letters, or to support an organisation with donations that is really effective at achieving the outcome that we want?
Thank you. I just add, I forgot my own call to action slide in my own talk, but I was also saying, like, there's your own consumption, what you can do through your consumption, but maybe more importantly, or at least as important, is what you do with your money, with your nation, and what you do with the rest of your time, what you volunteer for, what you work for. So a lot of people tend to focus on their own consumption, saying, like, I'm doing my part, I'm consuming differently, I'm stepping out of the system, I'm boycotting it, but I think probably you can have bigger impact with really doing things, with communicating about it, with raising awareness, and also with donating. Okay, we're going to close here. We're around for the drinks and for the food.
No,
so you can.
It's a call to action. I need to have some.
Yeah, I know.
Awesome.
So you can ask more questions to us, and I'm gonna pass the word to Chris to close it.